The streets of Iran are burning, not metaphorically, not in the language of protest rhetoric, but literally engulfed in flames that illuminate the night sky across dozens of cities. What began as scattered demonstrations has transformed into something far more volatile, a nationwide eruption of rage that has seen government buildings reduced to charred shells, police stations overrun and set ablaze, and symbols of the Islamic Republic's authority targeted with a ferocity that speaks to decades of accumulated grievances. The images emerging from cities across Iran paint a picture of a society that has reached a breaking point, where the usual mechanisms of control and suppression are being met not with submission but with fire. In the city of Karaj, just west of Tehran, an administrative building became a towering inferno that could be seen from miles away. The footage shows every floor consumed by flames, the structure's windows glowing orange against the darkness as thick smoke billows into the night. This wasn't a random act of vandalism or an accidental fire. This was deliberate, symbolic destruction carried out by protesters who have lost faith in the institutions meant to serve them. The building stood as a representation of bureaucratic power, of the state apparatus that controls nearly every aspect of Iranian life, and its destruction was a statement impossible to misinterpret. Local witnesses reported that the fire burned for hours before emergency services could even attempt to respond, whether due to the intensity of the blaze or the unwillingness of firefighters to enter a protest zone remains unclear. But Karaj was only one flashpoint in a night that saw coordinated acts of resistance across the country. In Isfahan, protesters set fire to a building belonging to IRIB, the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting Organization. IRIB is not simply a television network. It is the state's primary propaganda apparatus, the voice through which the government speaks to its people, carefully controlling narratives and suppressing dissent through its programming. For protesters to target this facility demonstrates a clear rejection not just of government policies, but of the entire information ecosystem the regime has constructed. Video verified by BBC Persian and Iran International shows the building engulfed in flames, with protesters maintaining distance as the fire consumed the structure. The symbolism is profound. By burning the broadcaster, demonstrators were attempting to silence the voice that has silenced them for so long. In Mashhad, Iran's second-largest city and a major religious center, several police stations were seized by protesters. The takeover of law enforcement facilities represents an extraordinary escalation, a direct challenge to the state's monopoly on force. One of these stations was subsequently set on fire, with images showing the building's facade blackened and windows blown out by the intensity of the heat. Mashhad holds particular significance in Iran's political and religious landscape. It is home to the shrine of Imam Reza, one of Shia Islam's most sacred sites, and has traditionally been considered a stronghold of conservative religious sentiment. That such dramatic acts of resistance are occurring in Mashhad suggests that opposition to the government has penetrated even into communities once thought reliably supportive of the Islamic Republic's clerical establishment. The city of Yazd saw its mayor's building burned to the ground during protests. Yazd, an ancient desert city known for its Zoroastrian heritage and distinctive architecture, has historically maintained a quieter political profile compared to larger urban centers. The fact that protesters there felt compelled to destroy the mayor's office indicates that this wave of unrest has spread far beyond the usual hotspots of Tehran and its immediate surroundings. The fire at the municipal building was thorough and destructive, leaving little but a smoking ruin by morning. Local authorities have been largely silent about the incident, either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the scale of the challenge they face. Tehran itself, the capital and the heart of the regime's power, experienced widespread violence and arson. Police vehicles were set ablaze in multiple districts, their twisted metal frames left smoldering on major thoroughfares. State buildings burned in areas including Ferdowsi Boulevard, Haft-e-Tur Square, and throughout the central city. These are not peripheral neighborhoods but central locations, visible and symbolically important parts of the capital. The targeting of police cars is particularly significant. These vehicles represent the most immediate and visible form of state authority on the streets, and their destruction is both practical, reducing the mobility of security forces, and symbolic, demonstrating that the instruments of repression can be vulnerable. Perhaps most striking was the reported attack on the Al-Rasul Mosque, described as a place where senior clerical figures have led prayers. Mosques occupy a unique position in the Islamic Republic. They are not merely houses of worship, but centers of political power, places where the fusion of religious authority and state control is most visible. For protesters to target a mosque represents either a profound shift in the nature of the opposition or an indication of how thoroughly the regime's religious legitimacy has been undermined in the eyes of many Iranians. The act challenges one of the foundational claims of the Islamic Republic, that it represents and protects the true interests of Islam and the faithful. When the faithful themselves turn against these institutions, the ideological foundations of the regime begin to crack. Reports also emerged of fires near facilities connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is far more than a military organization. It is an economic empire, a political force, and the ultimate guarantor of the regime's survival. Its tentacles reach into nearly every sector of Iranian society, from construction and telecommunications to oil and banking. It operates as a state within a state, answerable only to the supreme leader. Targeting IRGC-connected facilities is among the most dangerous acts protesters can undertake, as the guards have shown no hesitation in using lethal force to suppress dissent. Yet the willingness of demonstrators to take such risks suggests a level of desperation and determination that conventional crowd control methods may no longer be able to contain. In the Alborz province city of Ferdiz, the intervention of IRGC units resulted in reported casualties, including both dead and wounded. Local residents described harsh tactics by security forces, though official confirmation of casualty numbers remains absent. The lack of official information is typical of how the Iranian government handles such incidents, maintaining silence while unofficial reports circulate and families search for missing loved ones. The use of IRGC units rather than regular police in Ferdiz indicates that authorities view the situation as requiring military-level response, an acknowledgement that standard law enforcement has proven insufficient. State television broadcasts showed what it claimed were buses, cars, and motorcycles burning in the streets, along with fires at metro stations and banks. The images were intended to portray chaos and criminality, but they also inadvertently documented the scale and intensity of public anger. The government's narrative attempted to blame the unrest on the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran, known as the MEK or MKO, an exiled opposition group with a complicated and controversial history. The MEK has indeed conducted operations against the Islamic Republic in the past, and the government routinely attributes domestic unrest to foreign infiltrators and exiled opposition groups rather than acknowledging genuine grievances among the population. While organized opposition groups may attempt to capitalize on public discontent, the breadth and spontaneity of the protests suggest organic popular uprising rather than a coordinated campaign directed from abroad. A state television journalist reporting from Rasht, a Caspian seaport city, stood before burning buildings and described the scene as resembling a war zone. The comment, meant to emphasize the destruction and justify crackdowns, instead revealed the government's recognition of how serious the situation has become. Rasht Central Shariati Street, normally a commercial hub, was transformed into a landscape of shattered storefronts and burning debris. The journalist's description of destroyed shops along the entire street suggests sustained and widespread action rather than isolated incidents. Additional reports documented protest activity, arson and clashes in cities including Kermanshah, Dezful, Mashhar, Gorgan, and Darab. The geographic spread is remarkable, encompassing cities in the northwest, southwest, northeast, and south of the country. This is not a localized disturbance but a national phenomenon. In Darab specifically, a store belonging to a chain reportedly connected to the Revolutionary Guards was set on fire. Significantly, there were no reports of looting. The destruction was targeted and political rather than opportunistic criminality. This discipline among protesters, maintaining focus on symbols of state power while avoiding theft, complicates the government's ability to portray the unrest as mere lawlessness. The semi-official Tasnim news agency reported the death of one IRGC officer during clashes, a rare acknowledgement of casualties among security forces. Such admissions are typically made only when the facts are too widely known to suppress, suggesting that the actual toll may be higher. The death of an IRGC member is particularly sensitive for the regime, as the Revolutionary Guards are supposed to be invincible defenders of the revolution, and any suggestion of vulnerability undermines the aura of unstoppable force they project. Adding to the information warfare surrounding these events, reports emerged of manipulated video footage from Tabriz, purportedly showing participants supporting the IRGC. However, closer examination of the actual footage revealed chants declaring that Azerbaijan, referring to the Iranian province, is honorable while the IRGC is dishonorable. This incident highlights the parallel information battle occurring alongside the physical confrontations. Both the government and various opposition factions are attempting to shape the narrative, to claim popular support, and to delegitimize their opponents through selective editing and misrepresentation of events. In the age of smartphone cameras and social media, authentic footage circulates alongside propaganda, making it increasingly difficult but also increasingly important to verify the source and context of any images or videos. The current wave of protests did not emerge from nowhere. Iran has experienced periodic eruptions of mass discontent over the past several years, each driven by a combination of economic hardship, political repression, and social restrictions. International sanctions, government mismanagement, and the economic dominance of institutions like the IRGC have created an economy where inflation spirals, employment opportunities shrink, and the gap between a small elite and the struggling majority grows ever wider. Young Iranians, who make up a significant portion of the population, face a future of diminishing prospects despite often high levels of education. Women continue to face systematic legal and social discrimination, required to adhere to strict dress codes, and denied equal rights in marriage, divorce, inheritance, and numerous other areas of life. Previous protest movements, such as those in late 2019 and 2022, were met with severe crackdowns. In 2019, demonstrations initially sparked by fuel price increases led to a brutal response in which Amnesty International and other human rights organizations documented hundreds of deaths at the hands of security forces. Internet shutdowns isolated protesters from the outside world and from each other, allowing the government to suppress the uprising away from international scrutiny. The 2022 protests following the death of Mahsa Amini in custody of the morality police marked another watershed, with women leading demonstrations and publicly removing their hijabs in defiance of mandatory veiling laws. That movement, too, faced violent suppression, mass arrests, and even executions of those accused of participating in protests. What makes the current situation potentially more dangerous for the regime is the apparent willingness of protesters to move beyond peaceful demonstration to direct confrontation and the destruction of state property. While peaceful protest can be ignored or contained through mass arrests, the systematic targeting and burning of government buildings, police stations, and symbols of authority represents an escalation that cannot be easily dismissed. It forces a response, and the nature of that response will likely determine whether this crisis intensifies or eventually subsides like previous uprisings. The Iranian government faces a fundamental dilemma. Violent suppression has worked in the past to restore order, but each crackdown further delegitimizes the regime in the eyes of both the domestic population and the international community. The Islamic Republic has always claimed to derive its authority from popular support, from being the authentic voice of the Iranian people against Western imperialism and secular corruption. When that claim becomes obviously hollow, when the people themselves are burning images and buildings associated with the revolution and its leaders, the ideological foundation of the state weakens. Yet showing restraint or attempting meaningful reform risks emboldening protesters and encouraging further challenges to authority. Hardliners within the regime argue that any concession is a sign of weakness that will only invite more demands, while pragmatists recognize that the status quo is becoming increasingly unsustainable. International actors watch these developments with great interest but limited ability to influence events. Western governments have historically supported Iranian protest movements rhetorically while imposing sanctions meant to pressure the regime. However, these sanctions often have the unintended effect of worsening economic conditions for ordinary Iranians while doing little to change government behavior. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Israel view a weakened Iran as advantageous to their strategic interests, while Russia and China have generally supported the Islamic Republic as a counterweight to Western influence in the Middle East. None of these external parties can control the trajectory of events inside Iran, which will ultimately be determined by the balance of forces between the state and the protesters, and by the willingness of each side to continue escalating. The role of women in these protests deserves particular attention. Iranian women have been at the forefront of resistance to the regime's restrictions for years, and their participation in acts like publicly removing hijabs while participating in protests that involve burning buildings and images of religious and political leaders represents a profound challenge to the patriarchal and theocratic nature of the state. The detail from Karaj about women combining the burning of religious images with cigarette smoking, an act long stigmatized for women in Iranian society, illustrates how protesters are deliberately targeting multiple layers of social and religious control simultaneously. These are not merely political protests, but assertions of fundamental human dignity and the right to make personal choices free from state-imposed religious morality. The destruction of metro stations and banks, as shown in state television footage, points to the infrastructure dimension of the protests. Metro systems in Iranian cities are crucial for daily transportation for millions of people, and banks are essential for economic functioning. Targeting these facilities causes disruption that extends beyond symbolic protest to creating real obstacles for normal governance and economic activity. It also imposes costs on the state, forcing the diversion of resources to rebuilding and repair rather than other priorities. Whether these tactics ultimately serve the protesters' interests is debatable, as ordinary Iranians also depend on this infrastructure, but the willingness to accept such costs indicates the depth of anger and the desire to impose consequences on the regime. The information environment surrounding these protests is fragmented and contested. Iran's government maintains significant control over domestic internet infrastructure and can impose shutdowns or severe restrictions when it chooses. State media presents a narrative of foreign-backed chaos and criminality, while opposition satellite channels broadcasting from abroad and social media accounts share footage of protests and regime violence. Independent verification of specific claims is often difficult, particularly regarding casualty numbers, the sequence of events, or the motivations of participants. What is clear is that something significant is happening across multiple Iranian cities, that state property is being destroyed on a scale rarely seen, and that the government's response has included force that has resulted in casualties. The claim by state media that the MEK is responsible for the unrest is consistent with the government's long-standing pattern of attributing domestic opposition to external enemies. The MEK is a convenient scapegoat, a group that did conduct armed resistance against the Islamic Republic in its early years, that sided with Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, an act many Iranians consider treasonous, and that now operates from exile with backing from some Western governments. While the MEK undoubtedly would like to claim credit for destabilizing the regime and may attempt to insert itself into these events, the notion that it is orchestrating protests across dozens of cities simultaneously strains credibility. Genuine popular grievances are more than sufficient to explain the unrest without requiring the involvement of exiled opposition groups. The burning of the Al-Rasul Mosque is particularly significant in the context of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy claims. The regime presents itself as the guardian of Shia Islam and the protector of religious values against secular materialism and Western cultural imperialism. Mosques are supposed to be sacred spaces, beyond the reach of political conflict. When protesters target a mosque, especially one associated with prominent clerical figures who have led prayers there, it suggests that at least some segment of the population no longer accepts the regime's claim to religious authority. This could represent the emergence of a secular opposition that rejects the entire premise of clerical rule, or it could indicate that protesters distinguish between their faith and the political apparatus that has claimed to represent it. Either interpretation poses profound challenges for a government whose foundational ideology is the fusion of Islamic law and political power. The government's claim that shops along entire streets have been destroyed, as reported from Rasht, requires careful consideration. State media has incentives to exaggerate destruction to justify harsh crackdowns and to portray protesters as destructive vandals rather than citizens with legitimate grievances. However, the journalist's description and the accompanying footage do show significant damage. It's possible that the destruction is both real and being instrumentalized for propaganda purposes. The absence of looting, as noted in reports from Darab and implicitly elsewhere, is significant because it undermines the government's narrative of criminality and instead points to politically motivated destruction of specific targets. The use of IRGC forces rather than regular police in several locations indicates that the government views this as a security crisis requiring military-level response. The IRGC is trained and equipped for combat, not crowd control, and its deployment typically results in higher casualties. The guards have shown in past protests that they are willing to use lethal force without hesitation when they believe the regime is threatened. Their involvement suggests that authorities fear losing control and are prepared to impose order through whatever means necessary. This escalation by the state may in turn provoke further escalation by protesters, creating a dangerous spiral of violence. The geographic spread of protests from Tehran to cities like Yazd, Darab, Mashhad, Kermanshah, and others demonstrates that this is not merely discontent in the capital that might be isolated and contained. It represents a national crisis of legitimacy affecting urban centers across the country. Each city has its own local grievances, its own history of interaction with the central government, its own economic challenges. Yet the simultaneous eruption of protests suggests that local issues are connected to broader national problems, that Iranians in different regions are responding to similar conditions of repression and economic dysfunction. The attacks on facilities connected to the IRGC are particularly bold given the organization's power and ruthlessness. The Revolutionary Guards control vast economic resources, operate their own intelligence and security apparatus, and answer only to the supreme leader. They have been designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States and have been implicated in numerous human rights abuses domestically and in military operations abroad. Challenging the IRGC is among the most dangerous things an Iranian citizen can do, yet protesters appear willing to accept that risk. This suggests either desperation, a belief that they have nothing left to lose, or a calculation that the regime is weakened enough that such actions might actually succeed in forcing change. The manipulation of footage from Tabriz, where chants critical of the IRGC were presented as supportive, reveals the stakes in the information war surrounding these events. Both sides understand that international perception matters, that domestic morale among supporters and protesters depends on perceived momentum, and that the narrative surrounding events can be as important as the events themselves. The fact that authentic footage contradicting the state's claims circulated widely enough to be verified suggests that despite government efforts to control information, alternative sources of news and communication remain available to Iranians. State television's decision to broadcast images of burning buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure is itself noteworthy. While intended to demonstrate the chaos caused by protesters and justify the government's harsh response, such footage also documents the scale of resistance and might inadvertently inspire further action by demonstrating that the state can be challenged. The government's media strategy appears to be betting that most Iranians will be horrified by the destruction and turn against the protesters, but there is a risk that others will see evidence that the regime is vulnerable and can be fought. The detention of protesters, which is occurring though specific numbers are not available, follows the pattern of previous crackdowns. Mass arrests serve multiple purposes for the regime. They remove active participants from the streets, create fear among those considering joining protests, and provide the state with the ability to prosecute, imprison, or even execute individuals as examples. In past protest movements, prisoners have reported torture, forced confessions, and trials that lack basic due process protections. Families often go months without information about detained loved ones. The psychological toll of disappearances and detentions extends far beyond those directly arrested, affecting communities and creating an atmosphere of fear. At the same time, the regime's capacity for repression, while substantial, is not unlimited. Security forces can be stretched thin when protests occur simultaneously in multiple cities. Prolonged deployment creates fatigue and exposes personnel to the same economic hardships affecting other Iranians. There have been instances in past protests where some police or military personnel have shown sympathy for protesters or refused orders to shoot. While such cases remain exceptional, and the security apparatus has largely remained loyal, continued unrest tests the cohesion and morale of the forces on which the regime depends for survival. The economic dimension underlying these protests cannot be ignored. Iran's economy has been struggling for years under the weight of international sanctions, government mismanagement, corruption, and the economic dominance of institutions like the IRGC that are not subject to normal market forces or accountability. Inflation has eroded purchasing power, unemployment particularly among young people remains high, and basic goods are often scarce or unaffordable. The gap between official rhetoric about resistance to foreign pressure and the daily reality of economic struggle creates cynicism and anger. When people cannot afford food, when educated young people cannot find work, when even middle-class families face declining living standards, the government's ideological appeals lose their power. The international sanctions regime, particularly those reimposed by the United States after withdrawal from the nuclear agreement in 2018, has had complex and contradictory effects. While intended to pressure the Iranian government to change its behavior regarding its nuclear program and regional activities, the sanctions have primarily impacted ordinary Iranians. The regime has proven adept at circumventing sanctions through smuggling, black market operations, and continuing trade with countries like China and Russia. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens face shortages of medicine, difficulty accessing international financial systems, and economic isolation that limits opportunities. This creates a situation where the sanctions arguably strengthen the government by providing it with a convenient external scapegoat for economic failures while doing little to actually change regime behavior. The protests also occur against a backdrop of regional tensions and potential conflict. Iran's nuclear program continues to advance despite international pressure, bringing it closer to the capability to develop nuclear weapons should it choose to do so. Israel has indicated it will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons and has conducted operations against Iranian nuclear facilities and personnel in the past. The possibility of military confrontation between Iran and Israel, potentially drawing in the United States and other regional powers, creates additional uncertainty. Domestic instability in Iran complicates the government's ability to pursue its regional agenda and manage these external threats, potentially making it either more cautious or more inclined to create external crises to distract from internal problems. The role of social media and communication technology in these protests is significant despite government efforts at control. Iranians have become sophisticated at using VPNs and other tools to bypass internet restrictions and censorship. Footage of protests and government violence circulates on platforms like Telegram, Instagram, and Twitter despite being banned or restricted. This allows for coordination among protesters, documentation of events for the outside world, and the maintenance of morale through shared information. However, the same technology also allows the government to monitor communications, identify protest organizers, and track participants for later arrest. The digital dimension of the protests is thus a double-edged sword, providing both opportunities and dangers for those involved. What remains uncertain is whether this current wave of protests will follow the pattern of previous movements that were eventually suppressed through violence and mass arrests, or whether it represents a qualitative shift that the regime will be unable to contain. The systematic targeting of state property and symbols of authority, the geographic breadth of the unrest, and the apparent willingness of protesters to risk severe consequences all suggest a level of determination that exceeds previous movements. However, the Iranian government has demonstrated repeatedly its willingness to use extreme violence to maintain power, and there is no indication that it has become unwilling to do so now. The international community's response has been limited largely to statements of concern and monitoring of events. Western governments have condemned violence against protesters while maintaining sanctions on Iran. Regional powers are calculating how instability in Iran might affect their interests, with some likely pleased to see the regime weakened, and others concerned about unpredictable consequences of potential state collapse. No external actor has the ability or willingness to directly intervene in what remains an internal Iranian matter, meaning that the outcome will be determined by the balance of forces within the country. For ordinary Iranians, whether participating in protests or attempting to continue their daily lives amid the chaos, these are frightening and uncertain times. The economy was already struggling, and the disruption caused by protests and crackdowns will only worsen conditions. The threat of arrest, injury, or death looms for anyone who takes to the streets. Yet the fact that people continue to protest despite these risks indicates the depth of grievance and the sense that the current situation is intolerable. For many, particularly young people who have known only the Islamic Republic and its restrictions, the question is what future they have in a country where political freedom is absent, economic opportunity is scarce, and social control is pervasive. The burning buildings across Iran are symptoms of a society in crisis, a government losing legitimacy, and a population pushed to desperation. Whether this crisis leads to meaningful change, to harsh repression that restores stability, or to continued cycles of protest and crackdown remains to be seen. What is clear is that the fires illuminating Iranian cities are reflections of deeper flames of anger and frustration that have been building for years, and that will not be easily extinguished. Current developments show widespread destruction of government buildings, police stations, and symbolic structures across numerous Iranian cities including Karaj, Isfahan, Mashhad, Yazd, Tehran, and many others. Security forces including IRGC units have responded with force, resulting in reported casualties. This account is based on footage verified by BBC Persian and Iran International, reports from semi-official Iranian news agencies like Tasnim, state television broadcasts, and documentation from various cities showing fires and damaged infrastructure.